Η τεχνολογία καθημερινά αλλάζει τη ζωή μας και μας υποχρεώνει να προσαρμοζόμαστε συνεχώς σε νέες συνθήκες, τις οποίες καμιά φορά δεν είμαστε έτοιμοι να κατανοήσουμε και να αξιοποιήσουμε στον χώρο της εκπαίδευσης. Σήμερα, όσο ποτέ άλλοτε, στην εποχή της τεχνητής νοημοσύνης, αναπόφευκτα προωθούνται προηγμένες τεχνολογίες, για τις οποίες αγνοούμε τον τρόπο καλής χρήσης ως εργαλεία ενίσχυσης της μάθησης σε ένα ιδιαίτερα απαιτητικό περιβάλλον, όπως αυτό της σύγχρονης εκπαίδευσης. Το επιστημονικό πρόγραμμα του συνεδρίου, πάντα με τις σημαντικότερες επιστημονικές εξελίξεις, περιλαμβάνει εξαιρετικές εισηγήσεις που είμαι βέβαιος ότι θα συμβάλλουν σε μια καλύτερη κατανόηση της σύνδεσης μεταξύ των ΤΑΦΠΕ και της ανάγκης για την ενσωμάτωσή τους στη διδασκαλία και τη μάθηση προς όφελος του κοινωνικού συνόλου. Εύχομαι από καρδιάς καλή επιτυχία στις εργασίες του συνεδρίου.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Νομίζω ότι υπάρχει ακόμη ένας χαιρετισμός που θα κάνει ο κύριος Κόλλιας εκ μέρους.
Εκ μέρους της Περιφερειακής Διευθύντριας Πρωτοβάθμιας και Δευτεροβάθμιας Εκπαίδευσης Θεσσαλίας, της κυρίας Βασιλικής Γιάκα, η οποία λέει αποτελεί ιδιαίτερη τιμή από την πλευρά μου, την Περιφερειακή Διεύθυνση Πρωτοβάθμιας και Δευτεροβάθμιας Εκπαίδευσης Θεσσαλίας, η συμμετοχή στον ακαδημαϊκό διάλογο του παρόντος επιστημονικού συνεδρίου, αναφορικά με τις επιστημονικές αναλύσεις, τις ερευνητικές εργασίες, τις σύγχρονες μελέτες, τις κρίσεις των ΤΠΕ στην εκπαιδευτική διαδικασία, ομολογουμένως σε μια συνεχώς εξελισσόμενη κοινωνία, στον απόϊχο της τέταρτης βιομηχανικής επανάστασης, οι νέες τεχνολογίες αποτελούν αναπόσπαστο κομμάτι προόδου και σημαντικής εξέλιξης σε όλους τους τομείς του επιστητού και ιδιαίτερα στον χώρο της εκπαίδευσης. Σε παγκόσμιο επίπεδο, ψηφιακός μετασχηματισμός καθοδηγεί τις εξελίξεις στους εκπαιδευτικούς οργανισμούς και φέρνει όλους τους εμπλεκόμενους φορείς, εκπαιδευτικούς, γονείς, μαθητές, διοίκηση, αντιμέτωπους με νέα δεδομένα, νέα τεχνολογικά μέσα και δυνατότητες, αλλά και νέους επικοινωνιακούς κώδικες. Στο πλαίσιο αυτό, το ψηφιακό σχολείο με τις διάφορες πτυχές του, όπως το ψηφιακό φροντιστήριο, η ψηφιακή πύλη, το e-parents, αποτελεί πραγματικότητα για το ελληνικό εκπαιδευτικό σύστημα. Στόχος μας είναι μέσω της εφαρμογής του η προσβασιμότητα των απομακρυσμένων από τα αστικά κέντρα μαθητών στην εκπαιδευτική διαδικασία, η απόκτηση σύγχρονων γνώσεων και δεξιοτήτων όλων των μαθητών και γενικότερα η βελτίωση των μαθησιακών αποτελεσμάτων. Αναμένουμε οι συνεδρίες και τα panels, οι εκπαιδευτικές παρεμβάσεις, τα tutorials, μια αναφορά και ο σχολιασμός πάνω σε συγκεκριμένες μελέτες περίπτωσης, καθώς και τα απόστρες του συγκεκριμένου τριήμερου συνεδρίου, να αναδείξουμε μεθοδολογίες και καλές πρακτικές ενσωμάτωσης των ΤΠΕ στη διδασκαλία και τη μάθηση, δίνοντας ερεθίσματα για το τι μπορούν να προσφέρουν στη μαθησιακή διαδικασία και πώς μπορούν να γίνουν χρήσιμα και αποτελεσματικά εργαλεία, ενδυναμώνοντας την κριτική σκέψη των μαθητών μας. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Νομίζω ότι έχουμε τελειώσει με τους χαιρετισμούς. Να επαναλάβω ότι συνάδελφοι από τα τμήματα που θα ήθελαν να είναι μαζί μας, πρόεδροι και πριτάνης κλπ. Δεν μπορούν γιατί υπάρχει έκτακτη σύγκλιτος. Οπότε δεν υπάρχει άλλος χαιρετισμός. Να καλέσουμε τον κύριο Μικρόπουλο, ένας νέος συνάδελφος, δεν τον ξέρετε περισσότεροι. Τώρα κάνει τα πρώτα του βήματα στην ΕΤΠΕ για να μας κάνει την τιμή να κηρύξει την έναρξη του συνεδρίου. Θα τον μάθετε τώρα, καινούριος.
Καλησπέρα σας, αγαπητές και αγαπητοί. Πολλοί μας ρωτάνε γιατί εσείς μία ένωση των τεχνολογιών δεν κάνετε συνέδρια από απόσταση ή έστω υβριδικά. Γι' αυτό ακριβώς. Παρότι είμαστε λίγοι και καλοί στην έναρξη και συνηθίζεται αυτό, αρχίζει να έρχεται ο κόσμος, εξάλλου τον εργάσιμη μέρα σήμερα, γιατί ο σκοπός ενός συνεδρίου, εκτός από την παρουσίαση των εργασιών που μπορούμε να τις διαβάσουμε στα πρακτικά, που θα ξέρετε ότι ως Ένωση εδώ και 20 χρόνια τα έχουμε όλα τα πρακτικά ελεύθερα και στον ιστότοπο μας, αλλά και τώρα, όπως θα βγει και η σχετική ανακοίνωση στο ΕΚΤ, στα πρακτικά συνεδρίων, κάνουμε διαζώσεις συνέδρια γιατί θέλουμε να βρεθούμε να συζητήσουμε. Ο λόγος που κάνουμε ένα συνέδριο είναι να βρεθούν οι παλιοί με τους καινούριους, να γνωρίσω εγώ τους μεγάλους εδώ, όπως είναι ο προεδρεύων δίπλα μου με τα άσπρα μαλλιά, και να συζητήσουμε, να ανταλλάξουμε απόψεις, να δούμε πάνε τα πράγματα Ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω πάρα πολύ τους συναδέλφους από το Πανεπιστήμιο Θεσσαλίας όλους. Νομίζω ότι μέχρι τώρα τουλάχιστον, που αυτό μετράει, είναι το καλύτερο οργανωμένο συνέδριο αυτής της σειράς. Είχα συνεχή επικοινωνία με τα παιδιά, ιδιαίτερα με τον Μπάμπη, καθημερινή τηλεφωνική επικοινωνία. Έχουν κάνει μια άψογη οργάνωση. Σας καλωσορίζω, να περάσουμε καλά, να συζητήσουμε και εκτός των ανακοινώσεων. Καλή αρχή.
Τις εκπαίδευσεις, παρακαλώ.
Last but not least, έτσι.
Εξήγησα ότι θέλατε όλοι να έρθετε, αλλά πέσαμε σε σύγκλιτο.
Ναι, ζητώ συγγνώμη. Είχαμε σύγκλιτο που είναι απαραίτητη η παρουσία των Προέδρων και ζήτησα αυτή τη στιγμή μια μικρή διακοπή για να μπορέσω να κάνω το χαιρετισμό. Καλησπέρα καταρχήν σε όλους και όλες. Συγγνώμη γιατί ανέβηκα τρέχοντας τις σκάλες. Είναι μεγάλη χαρά και τιμή να φιλοξενούμε στο Πανεπιστήμιο Θεσσαλίας το 8ο Πανελλήνιο Συνέδριο για την ένταξη και χρήση των TPS στην εκπαίδευση. Το τμήμα μας, το Παιδαγωγικό Τμήμα Προσχολικής Εκπαίδευσης, ενθέρμως υποστηρίζει την Ναι, συγγνώμη. Ενθέρμως, λοιπόν, υποστηρίζει την αξιοποίηση των TPS στην εκπαιδευτική διαδικασία. Προσωπικά, συνεχίζω συστηματικά να εκπλήσωμαι από το τεράστιο εύρος των δυνατοτήτων. Ευχαριστώ. Αυτής της δυναμικής σχέσης μεταξύ της εκπαίδευσης και της τεχνολογίας. Και θα ήθελα εδώ να πω και μια πολύ σύντομη προσωπική ιστορία. Μέσα στην περίοδο του COVID, μια συνεργάτηδα του τμήματος και ήδη κάτοχος διδακτορικού, μου πρότεινε να επιβλέψω μια μεταδιδακτορική έρευνα με θέμα την διερεύνηση των δυνατοτήτων ψηφιακής διδασκαλίας ενός μαθήματος με τίτλο «Χορός και σωματική έκφραση». Ένα μάθημα που το έχουμε χρόνια στο τμήμα και είναι ιδιαίτερα αγαπητό από τους φοιτητές. Όταν λοιπόν πρωτάκουσα αυτή την πρόταση για μια ψηφιακή διδασκαλία ενός τέτοιου μαθήματος, ήμουν αρνητικός. Παρ' όλα αυτά, συμφωνήσαμε να κάνουμε την προσπάθεια. Πώς θα ήταν δυνατόν ένα μάθημα που αφορά την κίνηση, την έκφραση, τη συλλογικότητα, το συναίσθημα, το χορό να διδαχθεί ψηφιακά? Ήμουν παρόν σε όλα τα μαθήματα. Πραγματικά εντυπωσιάστηκα από τις δυνατότητες των ψηφιακών μέσων και των δυνατοτήτων που μπορεί να παρέχει η τεχνολογία ακόμα και σε ένα τόσο βιωματικό μάθημα. Φυσικά δεν θέλω να παρεξηγηθώ. Προφανώς προτιμώ τα διαζώσεις μαθήματα και επικοινωνία από τα αντίστοιχα ψηφιακά, αλλά αυτή η εμπειρία που μόλις σας μετέφερα έδειξε σε μένα, που θεωρώ τον εαυτό μου έτσι μια κλασική περίπτωση διδάσκοντα, ότι η εκπαίδευση και τεχνολογία, αν συνδυαστούν κατάλληλα, μπορούν να δώσουν εξαιρετικά αποτελέσματα. Και καθώς ανήκω στο Παιδαγωγικό Τμήμα Προσχολικής Εκπαίδευσης, τα αποτελέσματα αυτά μπορούμε να τα δούμε ήδη από το νηπιαγωγείο. Πάντα φυσικά μέσα από κατάλληλες διδακτικές και παιδαγωγικές προσεγγίσεις. Οι μαθητές και οι μαθήτρες του νηπιαγωγείου έρχονται ήδη με ψηφιακές δεξιότητες που πολλές φορές είναι περισσότερες από αυτές των νηπιαγωγών, των δασκάλων τους. Αυτός είναι ένας ακόμη λόγος και δίνει μια ακόμη μεγαλύτερη αξία στο σημερινό συνέδριο. Επανερχόμενο στο συνέδριο, θα ήθελα να σταθώ σε 3 πράγματα. Το πρώτο αφορά στο ιδιαίτερα πλούσιο πρόγραμμα. Δεκάδες ενδιαφέροντα θέματα από πολλά διαφορετικά πεδία, από το ψηφιακό παιχνίδι και την ψηφιακή αφήγηση μέχρι τη μοντελοποίηση και την τεχνητή νοημοσύνη. Νομίζω ότι πραγματικά όσοι θα συμμετάσχετε στις εργασίες του συνεδρίου θα δυσκολευτείτε πολύ να επιλέξετε σε ποια συνεδρία θα προτιμήσετε να παρακολουθήσετε. Ποια συνεδρία θα προτιμήσετε να παρακολουθήσετε. Το δεύτερο στοιχείο που θέλω να σταθώ αφορά στους σημαντικούς προσκεκλημένους εισηγητές και εισηγήτριες, όλους και όλες με βαθιά γνώση του αντικειμένου τους. Μια ιδιαίτερη μνήα στους καθηγητές Sannino και Engeström οι οποίοι θα τους ακούσουμε σε λίγο να μιλάνε για το πολύ ενδιαφέρον πλαίσιο της CHAT, Cultural Historical Activity Theory. Τέλος, το τελευταίο σημείο που θα ήθελα να αναδείξω αφορά στη συνεργασία μεταξύ των τμήματων του Πανεπιστημίου Θεσσαλίας, μια συνεργασία που πιστεύω είναι όχι μόνο αναγκαία, αλλά μπορεί να αποβεί και ιδιαίτερα καρποφόρα. Κλείνοντας, θέλω να συγχαρώ την Επιστημονική και Οργανωτική Επιτροπή του Συνεδρίου, τους αγαπητούς και αγαπητές συναδέλφους που τη στελεχώνουν, να ευχηθώ καλή επιτυχία στις εργασίες και φυσικά για όσους δεν ζείτε στο Βόλο, να ευχηθώ να χαρείτε τη διαμονή σας και όλα όσα η πόλη έχει να σας προσφέρει, συμπεριλαμβανομένων των τσιπουράδικων. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ, Τέιδο. Και πάλι συγγνώμη για την καθυστέρηση και τον τρόπο ομιλίας.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. Μόνο πριν ξεκινήσουμε ένα ευχαριστώ στην κυρία Γαλήνη Σαπουτζάκη, συνάδελφο από το τμήμα. Όπως ίσως είδατε και στο πρόγραμμα, οι κεντρικές ομιλίες θα καταγραφούν. Ενδεχομένως θα ανέβουν και στο YouTube αργότερα. Και για αυτές θα έχουμε και διερμηνία στην ελληνική νοηματική γλώσσα. Ειδικά το κομμάτι από αγγλικά για να γίνεται διερμηνία είναι εξαιρετικά δύσκολο. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ τη συνάδελφο, την κυρία Σαπουτζάκη, που μας υποστηρίξει σε αυτό. Γαλήνη, εδώ, πού είναι καλύτερα? Να καθίσεις.
Να κάθομαι από εκεί. Ωραία, κάτσω εκεί.
Hello. Να καλωσορίσουμε έτσι και τους ομιλητές μας. Hello, Iro and Annalisa, and we are. I'm going to say very few words about you at the beginning. Οι σημερινοί μας ομιλητές, η κυρία Annalisa Sannino και ο κύριος Engeström, είναι σημαίνοντες ερευνητές στον χώρο των θεωριών για τη μάθηση και τις αλλαγές πλαισίου που τη συνοδεύουν. Η δουλειά τους αφορά όχι μόνο την τυπική εκπαίδευση, αλλά και τη μάθηση που λαμβάνει η χώρα στην εργασία ή σε κοινότητες και περιλαμβάνει συμμετοχή σε παρεμβάσεις με μεγάλο κοινωνικό αντίκτυπο. Ο ομότιμος καθηγητής Engeström είναι διευθυντής του Κέντρου Έρευνας για τη Δραστηριότητα, την Ανάπτυξη και τη Μάθηση στο Ελσίνκι. Η κυρία Sannino είναι τακτική καθηγήτρια στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Τάμπερε, στη Σχολή Εκπαίδευσης και Πολιτισμού, όπου ηγείται της ερευνητικής ομάδας RESET, η οποία έχει γίνει βασικός εταίρος στην κινητοποίηση της κοινωνίας των πολιτών για την εξάλειψη των αστέγων στη Φινλανδία. Στη σημερινή τους ομιλία θα μας μιλήσουν για εργαστήρια αλλαγής, Change Laboratories, μια προσέγγιση που ήδη χρησιμοποιείται από εκπαιδευτικούς που δραστηριοποιούνται στη βελτίωση της διδασκαλίας τους και τις αλλαγές που φέρνει η ψηφιοποίηση στα εργαστήρια αυτά. So I give the floor to Professor Engeström and Professor Sannino to start.
Thank you. And I would like to thank the organizers and all of you for inviting us. This is, for us, a very interesting opportunity to get to know also your work and to exchange our ideas. We are two scholars from Finland. Annalisa Sannino is a professor at Tampere University, and I am a professor emeritus at University of Helsinki. And our shared background is cultural historical activity theory. This is the theoretical and methodological framework that we use in our work. And the title of our keynote presentation is Information and Communication Technology as Instrumentality for Transformative Agency in Education. Experiences from Cultural Historical Activity Theory. We have divided our labor so that first I will present some fairly general outline for understanding where we see the role of digital instruments in education at the moment, and how what is the historical significance of the current situation. And then Annalisa will take over and present more concrete material from recent studies, especially from recent change laboratory intervention studies conducted in different parts of the world, in which the information and communication technology has played a significant role. So I will start now, and I will go for the first slide, which is already shown to you. Our basic starting point is that digitalization can have a significant impact in education, but only when it is put in the service of a vision or program of pedagogical transformation, which concerns entire schools and communities. In other words, digitalization alone is not a solution or a kind of a future vision on its own. It has to be embedded in the service of a broader pedagogical perspective. Such deep transformations in education require sustained collective agency on part of the practitioners and key stakeholders, including the students, the learners themselves, but also including communities in which the schools are located. And we argue that digital technologies can be seen not only as instruments that support learning, but as instruments that actually can facilitate and support transformative agency on the part of practitioners and students and communities. Digital technologies can actually have a function that elicits these kinds of sustained and visionary change efforts among people involved in education. So this is the general view that we want to present here. And now I would like to go to the next slide. Thank you. And we, in activity theory, we like to think about transformations in terms of the concept of zonal proximal development. And this means that transformations are not something that have a predefined, strict endpoint or goal that is dictated from above, but genuine transformations, emancipatory transformations, are accomplished by facing contradictions in the current reality and moving toward possibilities. In a way, it is a zone of possibilities which needs to be charted and gradually turned into a new model of the activity. There is no predetermined endpoint. And this kind of zone of proximal development can be depicted with the help of two dimensions. Here, at the very general level in this figure, we suggest that two important dimensions for the transformation of schools and educational systems are, on one hand, the horizontal dimension, moving from what is often called surface learning or skin-deep learning of ready-made knowledge, ready-made correct answers, toward learning and teaching to ask questions and find principles rather than just specific correct answers. In other words, this is a shift from asking what to asking why. So in a way, this dimension depicts movement from skin-deep learning to in-depth learning, which tries to understand the world by looking at the foundational mechanisms, principles, and causes behind superficial phenomena. It's obvious why this dimension is needed, because in the current age, learners and teachers are bombarded by huge amounts of information and superficial knowledge, which can be completely overwhelming and which does not necessarily help people to grasp what is essential and to design their own way toward future. Now, the vertical dimension in this picture represents movement from isolated, encapsulated classrooms and schools to classrooms and schools which are in collaboration with outside actors, which open up to the society and find allies with whom education is accomplished. This is also absolutely necessary today. Schools alone are not anymore enough. Education must be accomplished in collaboration between schools and other societal actors for the common good and for tackling these very demanding learning challenges that we face today. Now, if we look at this fourth field that emerges, the field on the upper right-hand corner is where the future should be, but it's not easy to move to educational practices and institutions which can combine deep learning with joining forces with outside actors. We don't have very strong examples of this type of educational practice yet. These are solutions that need to be built. They are something that Annalisa Sannino has called enacted utopias. Now, next slide, please. The dotted line here represents the movement. We could call the present situation in the world of education around the globe the regime of neoliberal performativity. Educational systems are dominated by pressures to test and grade students in a way that serves competition and individualism. This type of regimes of performativity, continuous performing in tests and exams without much concern for actual understanding of what is learned, is currently the, let's say, main obstacle to change in education. This type of regime of neoliberal performativity, as it has been called by Stephen Ball and others. Now, we see the movement from this point toward future, toward the zone of proximal development as emerging new instrumentality of expansive learning and transformative agency, in which various types of resources, including digital resources of information and communication technology, are put to serve new types of learning and new types of agency among the learners and teachers. This is a very difficult transformation, but it's a necessary one. Next slide, please. To briefly characterize the the regime of neoliberal performativity, I would like to point three characteristics. First, in this kind of educational settings, performance is motivated by continuous competitive assessment, testing, and grading of individual learners. And this assessment is typically built in the digital applications and learning environments that are currently offered to schools and educational institutions. Secondly, this type of regime uses digital applications and learning environments which are designed and implemented as self-sufficient closed packages. We might call them digital bubbles, which seldom actually have meaning and interconnections with other spheres of the students' learners' lives. They, in a way, are completely self-sufficient, very, very typically. This means that digital applications become commodities that are bought and sold and usually cannot really be touched by the learners and instructors because they are already closed packages. The third characteristic of this type of regime is that these digital applications and learning environments are often imposed on learners. Their contents and uses are not jointly debated, discussed, and planned by learners and teachers, like I said, simply because they are closed packages. Now, of course, this is somewhat, let's say, exaggerated picture of the situation. But largely, we can say that what has been evolving over the past few decades in the digitalization of education seems to follow this model of neoliberal performativity. Of course, it has cracks and contradictions and new possibilities, but we cannot ignore these very problematic features that I have just listed. Next slide, please. So what we envision as the zone of proximal development, the world of expansive learning and transformative agency in education. The first characteristic is that learning is driven by the will to resolve contradictions and conflicts of motives in the learner's lives and interests, to open up new possibilities of creation and understanding. In that sense, it's deeply open-ended kind of learning. Secondly, digital applications in this type of education are designed and used as open components of an evolving multimodal instrumentality. And there is constant movement and hybridization between digital and other modes of representation and knowledge. They can be textual, symbolic, iconic, pictorial, enacted, embodied. A whole variety of modes of representation is offered, and the learners and teachers move between these modes and interconnect and hybridize them creatively. And the third feature is that the contents and practices of learning are planned jointly by the learners and the teachers. And also communities and actors from outside the school are involved in this development of instruction. It is not only a matter of inside school actors, but also allies of schools outside. This type of world of learning is necessary if humanity wants to actually allow our young generations to cope with the challenges, the global challenges that we're facing. Next slide, please, and this will be my final slide. To sum it up, this movement into the zone of proximal development of school instruction includes a shift from governmentality to instrumentality. In other words, instead of being governed by the digital applications and the information and communication technologies, these will serve as instruments interconnected with other modes of knowledge creation and representation. From digital applications as imposed packages to digital applications as components of an evolving instrumentality used by learners and teachers. In other words, it's a shift from closed bubbles to open worlds of exploration and creation, and a shift from motivation to volition. Instead of being motivated by testing, by grades, by constant assessment pressures, a will to learn, a volition to learn must prevail. In other words, from performing for grades to resolving conflicts to open up possibilities. These three shifts, interconnected shifts, are involved in this kind of transformation. Now, this is the general landscape we want to start with, and I now hand it over to Annalisa Sannino.
Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. No, the previous one. Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for this opportunity of sharing our views on this important topic. I am very grateful for this invitation, and I'm very much looking forward to more connections between all of us. What Yrjö just presented up to now is a conceptual view on this topic. And he has been doing that by utilizing an instrument that is very typical of cultural historical activity theory. This instrument being the fourth field that he just presented to you. So we are showing to you also how this instrumentality works in our own work. But in fact, this fourth field that Yrjö has just presented is the result of not only analysis that we have conducted in different studies by ourselves, researchers, but also this is an instrument which is constantly utilized in our interventions that we call change laboratories, which are a form of intervention that derives from the conceptual framework of cultural historical activity theory. And within this conceptual framework, there is also a perspective on agency, which is called transformative agency, or TADS. When Yrjö mentioned agency, will, he was referring to this type of agency that can be fostered by educational processes, but our research has shown that this requires instruments. And the fourth field of the zone of proximal development is one of these instruments. But in the following, my intention is to go a little bit more deeply into the concreteness of the use of this instrument and other instruments stemming directly from the theory, but that are utilized in very practical ways in our change laboratories interventions. Now, when we talk about the will to learn, the will to change educational activities, and the will to utilize digital instruments as well to these endeavors, we, in this framework, we refer to one main precondition and starting point for change. And this precondition and starting point is called conflict of motives. This is a notion that comes straight from Vygotsky, although it was only up to 2015 that this became knowledge in academic circles. Other aspects of Vygotsky's work have been emphasized, but not this one. And for will to change, will to learn, especially when we talk about collectives, the conflict of motive is really crucial. And this is a clash between two opposite motives that may paralyze the undertaking of transformative actions. Now, we are talking about something that seemingly is very abstract. In fact, it's something extremely close to the experiences of all of us, both as individuals and part of collectives. Take the example of the conflict between fear and trust that is often experienced by teachers in schools with very demanding pupils. In my country of origin, in the south of Italy, it is not an uncommon experience when one teacher is facing students in areas which are particularly problematic. Now, this was also an experience that already years ago, and you see the reference here from 2002, we are talking an early study done with the Change Laboratory and aspects of digital learning. This was already 2002 when similar experiences have been identified in a school in Finland. The conflict among teachers between fear and trust experienced by the teachers in a school which used to have empty corridors to avoid acts of vandalism during recess. As a consequence, the students were sitting on the floor during recess. When facing now the second point that is crucial both in change laboratories, but most importantly in ways we do together with change laboratories, we do foster transformative agency and learning with our interventions, is that when facing a conflict of motives with practitioners, typically practitioners seek support, material support, instrumental support that allows them to find a way out. And often some of these materials look exactly like what Yrjö has presented you, namely a vision for a different way of thinking and acting in education. But this vision don't come necessarily only from the head of researchers and from the implications of their studies. They actually can also be the outcome of processes such as the change laboratories. And an example is when this conflict of motives between fear and trust was triggered by the case taken up by a researcher that noticed, hey, in your school, an educational institution, your pupils are sitting on the floor during recess. What do you think about this as an educator, as an adult, as a person in charge of vulnerable youth? This was the beginning of a long process that eventually led to change, to the point that desks and computers were purchased, made available in this context, and nobody vandalized the new purchased computers. Next slide, please. So this is how a change laboratory usually look like. Now, in the interest of time, I will guide you through a very rapid visual journey toward a change laboratory and its instruments. Now, the change laboratory instrumentality typically are very material. And most of the research done in cultural historical activity theory with the change laboratory method has been primarily done with face-to-face change laboratories in contexts like these presented in these photographs. Next slide, please. Now, we use different instruments. The surfaces were presented in the previous slide. You see one of these surfaces here on the right-hand side of these other photographs. But what these people are doing in these pictures, including two researchers, but also practitioners, is to create a history wall. Because naturally change is also necessitated to face what has been happening before, so that the same mistakes are not repeated when one designs new ways of doing things in an activity. So the history wall that these people are constructing on the wall is the history of this, of one particularly turbulent phase in this particular organization, that in this case was an organization for young people who had experienced homelessness and therefore were housed by the social services. But next slide. So another instrumentality is there for you. Two more instruments that we use typically in the change laboratory, hands-on. Notice on the right-hand side is the force field that also Yrjö has used in his own conceptualization. But this is actually the result of the analysis that are presented with the activity system, the unit of analysis of cultural historical activity theory, of the very activity that these participants are doing. So these are two other instrumentalities of the change laboratory, namely analyzing the activity with the same tools we use in our research, but this is done together with the participants in our change laboratories. And the results of this analysis lead to the force field of the zone of proximal development that you see in the right-hand side of this photograph. So these are parts of the instrumentalities of the change laboratory when it is carried out in face-to-face mode. Next slide, please. At their best, these processes of participatory analysis, participatory modeling of innovations that result from the participatory analysis and are also done in a participatory way, lead to co-written documents, which are action plans on how to implement the newly designed innovation. And you see in this picture two of such documents that were produced in this particular organization for vulnerable youth at the end of two change laboratories. And these are documents written not only by the researchers, but by researchers and the practitioners that have been participating in these events. Now, you see the type of instrumentalities we use when we want to foster collective learning and collective transformative agency in activities, including school educational activities. Next slide, please. Then the COVID came, 2000. Do these instrumentalities for conceptual and envisioning work function if they are turned into digital instrumentalities? This is the question we had to ask ourselves as educators and as researchers who, when the COVID broke out, had many different processes of change laboratories going on, not only in Finland, but also in other parts of the world. So how to continue this work now? And so we worked on a case of online peer learning among professionals. These professionals I showed you in this photo with the history wall when we were working as researchers together with the practitioners in this organization for vulnerable youth. Next slide, please. Yes, you see the outcome of this work in, no, it's the previous slide, please. Yes, thank you. You see the outcome of this work in this reference at the end of this slide from 2001 on digital peer learning for transformative professional agency. When we experimented with different types of solutions to make these instruments of the change laboratory, face-to-face change laboratory, in a digital form, the experimentation led to these considerations as our starting point. These are very critical because these are three challenges that the literature of online peer learning and professional agency has presented. The first is the spectator challenge. The second is the challenge of drawing in details. The third one is the discontinuity challenge. These three challenges are very familiar to educators, especially after 2000, when we had to massively turn to digitalized forms of education. So the spectator challenge is this phenomenon that many participants in our online lessons, in our interventions online, just remain watching, reading, listening, but they do not really get involved in debates, in co-construction. They are just there. They don't express themselves. And this can go on and on for weeks. The challenge of drawing in details, it's another one. When digital learning becomes an opportunity of pouring out details without identifying what is really essential. And finally, the discontinuity challenge, which is basically the discontinuity between what happens online and what happens in the non-digital world outside. Next slide, please. Yes. At the end of this process that started with these considerations of the three challenges, in our 2021 article that I just mentioned a few seconds ago, we reached an unprecedented number of participants. They are listed here, 220 participants in 10 online workshops. 96 practitioners created actually user accounts after the workshops and accessed web forums for further discussion. And 63 among those present in the workshops also became users of the web forums. What's more, these participants in the project came from 12 municipalities in Finland and 56 different organizations. So a world opened up for cultural historical activity theory and change laboratory research on collective learning and transformative agency on the basis of this experience. So we continued these experimentations further. Next slide, please. What we learned from this experimentation was three things in particular. In order to respond to the spectator challenge, a good starting point is the cultivation of conflict of motives that I mentioned before. Remember the example of the teacher or the pupil or whoever facing the paralysis of the will between fear and trust. This type of phenomena, this type of experiences are engaging for the participants. And our digital experience with this first attempt of moving the change laboratory instrumentalities online led to evidence that cultivating conflict of motives actually is very engaging and can counteract the spectator challenge. In response to the challenge of drawing in details, we saw that some of the digitalized versions of the instrumentalities of change laboratories actually helped focusing on the essential in these online workshops and seminars. And this counteracted the challenge of drawing in details. And finally, the discontinuity challenge. This is a bit trickier because it's not only what you do within the workshops, but how you situate the workshops and the seminars into what is happening already from some time before. The reason why we could mobilize so many people is that we had already some time worked face-to-face and hands-on in change laboratories with these practitioners before COVID broke out and we had to move directly online. Notice that their participation was totally voluntary. They didn't have to participate in this project because it was not binding. So their numbers were a surprise to us. And the explanation we came about is the following. This could happen because we could establish links between the past and the future, between the digital world and the real world. Then next slide. I'm almost finishing. We continued these change laboratories experimentations both in China and in Italy, in change laboratories in educational settings more specifically. The China experimentation was actually very successful and generated very long-lasting developments and innovations, which are at the moment being implemented both in the university that initiated this change laboratory and also in primary schools that collaborate with this university for internships in primary schools. The experience in Italy was in the field of professional tertiary education in the agro-food sector, and unfortunately didn't go very well. And the reasons, in my view, were very critically linked to the discontinuity challenge. Differently from the China context, the Italian context was not sufficiently rooted in experiences that happened before these online seminars with the change laboratory in the realities of the contexts of these teachers. Next slide. Now a very rapid movement through these next slides This is a version just with the Microsoft whiteboard. These were the three surfaces that we usually have materially in change laboratory, such as in the picture that just was presented to you at the beginning of my talk. Next, please. So the model surface was utilized was turned in a digital form in the following way. Next. If you punch on this, yes, on this video, we can see a few seconds of how the Chinese people participating in this change laboratory online. Yes, you can see how the modeling, how the participatory analysis using the triangle from the theory is being filled online by all the teachers and the students involved in this and supervisors in this change laboratory, simply by using an online co-editing app that in China is called Jinshan. Something similar was also organized in the Italian change laboratory and worked rather well. So this is, the video just gives you a sense of how they fill in the different corners of the activity system. Next slide. Yes, and this is what the analysis led to. So the results of this analysis crystallized in these models, and the arrows here, the multiple arrows you see, especially in the evidenced in colors in the left-hand side of this picture, gives you an idea of what were the criticalities, what were the dysfunctions in their educational activity. And all this work was done online. None of these participants, neither in China or in Italy, in these change laboratories met face to face. Next slide, please. Then the ideas and tools, also this surface that is utilized typically in face-to-face change laboratories became a digitalized tool. Next. Yes, simply with an empty field, like at the bottom of this picture on the left-hand side, that was then filled with ideas and tools that were emerging and were then feeding into the innovations that were produced. Next. And then the mirror. The mirror is a particular kind of surface. I cannot go into the details of this, but to tell you what it is, it's primarily an instrumentality that opens up the evidence of the conflict of motives. For instance, teachers in interviews telling what are their conflicts. But it is not because we asked them, it's because evidence emerging from the analysis made this conflict of motives being voiced. Next. So a lot of video clips from interviews were utilized to this end, to open up the conflict of motive. Next. And finally, this is also one other instrument that was also utilized online. Remember the history wall that was done by hand on the wall? By using simply a PowerPoint template, it was possible to construct an online history wall. Next. And this is finally the result of all this, both in China on the right-hand side and in Italy on the left-hand side. Unfortunately, in the case of Italy, this did not lead to the implementation of these innovations, probably for the reason I have already mentioned to you. In China, instead, these arrows indicate actual projects that were developed and are now still in the process of being further developed and implemented in many schools affiliated with this university. Next. One other thing I would like to mention is that these three surfaces here on the right-hand side that are usually used in face-to-face meetings with just felt pens and became digitalized, they also have a function of validation. And it is very important that this type of surfaces are filled while the process of learning goes on in this workshop and seminars, so that the participants can see what the researcher is writing and what the researcher will be using as further instrumentalities for the conceptual work and the innovations, and can say, stop, I think that you have misunderstood what I meant. So there is a validation function inbuilt in this. So this is research that also aims at rigor in its design. And finally, I guess this is my next slide, the next one. Yes. Now, what we learn from here? Full-scale participatory analysis using cultural historical activity theory can be carried out also online. And this doesn't need compromising the basics of this methodological approach. Online formative interventions, such as the Change Laboratory, should, however, not be designed as standalone arrangements or remain isolated events, because otherwise we miss opportunities for these to generate a momentum in real life. And that's what actually at the end, what all education is all about, that it has an impact on reality. Greater impact will be gained when these interventions in their digitalized form also are embedded in long-term efforts. So all creativity among educators should really be mobilized to find connections between what has motivated the people in the long term so far and continue with digital seminars, etc. And this means a radical shift from the logic of limited in time projects. It means to invest in principled initiatives, co-creating instrumentalities that can foster and sustain collective work, which can be motivating and it can stand the ground of time, even in turbulent educational contexts. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope this all made some sense to you.
So now it's, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And it is time to get some questions from the audience. Personally, I found very interesting this connection that you make many times in the conferences that we make. People present what they do, but in an isolated way, like we tried this thing and it worked with this particular classroom or that particular classroom. And we all know that nothing will essentially happen if there is not a broader effort and if the school itself does not change, or if the teachers that work there do not collaborate and find a way. And many times they are influenced by higher levels in the education system, but then people feel, as you said, like disempowered, we cannot do anything. And these views about transformative agency are particularly applicable in our case, I think. And so I think sometimes we feel uneasy to ask questions because there is such a big distance between what we face in everyday lives in schools with this idea of people collaborating among themselves and feeling that they can have an influence on what happens in their own schools. So in Finland, but maybe I shouldn't talk so much, so while we were talking, is there some question that you would like to pose?
Anna.
So, we have also a microphone for whoever wants to ask a question.
So let's try. I would like to thank you so much for this insightful presentation. Just out of curiosity, how do you actually, I mean, as researchers, manage to cope with the practitioners and collaborate with the practitioners? I mean, how much training do the practitioners need to undertake in order to be able to participate in this chat analysis scheme of yours? I mean, I would estimate that it would take a couple of years of extensive study before someone actually gets a firm grounding of the concepts and understands what, for example, the chat scheme involves and what it takes to undertake some sort of analysis using that scheme. Do you actually guys have to train the practitioners? And how much time and effort does it actually take? I mean, it has always been like a thing that has puzzled me by reading your work. I mean, how do you guys actually pull it off? How do you manage to do it? Just out of curiosity.
Yuri, since you invented the methodology, perhaps you want to respond to this. Very interesting, very important question, actually. Yuri, would you like to?
Very briefly, we don't train practitioners. When they engage in struggles to transform their own activity, they are often very strongly motivated by those challenges in their own activity, and then it means that they kind of join in something that will last a long time, which is not necessarily quick fix. Typically, we don't promise any quick solutions because these solutions must be generated by the practitioners themselves, and these are owned by the practitioners by themselves. They are not something that we researchers own. So this means that, in a way, the practitioners accept that this is not a quick way to grasp something. And but surprisingly enough, we often see that when something clicks, it can also can become very intense and actually quite fast. When the practitioners identify a critical contradiction and start to design a solution to that, it can be surprisingly fast. It doesn't mean that they become suddenly great theorists, and it's not the purpose of the idea. They don't have to become theorists. The point is that if the tools work, they can be also learned quite quickly.
If I can add something, thank you so much for this question. In fact, we start always from the possibilities of opening up the needs that these professionals have in their own activities. And this is in itself quite motivating, but we don't ask for these needs. We make these needs voiced by starting from video clips or evidence that things are not working in the activity. And this leads then people to start opening up on their conflict of motives, on what paralyzed their action and involvement in change. And this is the beginning of learning and transformative agency. And this is really motivating. But they are not quick fixes to these conflicts of motives. It requires really to work together on a long term. So usually when we select a school, when we select an organization to work in, it is for a long-term commitment. And whether they are funding or not involved, we continue that. It is our own part of our own ethic of work in research. And this is usually the best type of experience one can gain. But as I already have mentioned in my own part of the talk, sometimes even that doesn't work. What I see is that practitioners find in these journeys a space that is quite unique, and they do not have it usually in their organizations, as a very atypical space of learning with researchers and with their colleagues. Thank you so much for this opportunity of opening up that aspect.
So,
thank you for these responses. Just a short follow-up, if I'm allowed. Yeah?
if I think, Annalisa, you said, and I don't know if you are pressed by time very hard.
I have to catch a train, but I am curious about the follow-up, and then I can run fast.
It's like putting different, for example, animals in the same cage and see how that, they like figure stuff out on their own, so to speak, just like in a sort of
except that we researchers are part of the animals in this, because we also have no idea what are the solutions unless we are able, together with the others, to put them together in the process.
So you don't have to develop an expertise in their own fields, and neither do they have to become, let's say, for example, cognizant of activity theory or anything. It's just
absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely, but some sort of field work for us, it's necessary to even understand what they are talking about. This is very different depending on where you are doing the research. Usually in schools, the language is not very different from what we are used in our own fields. But when we go to hospitals, for instance, or particular fields of technology, then there the field work becomes really even more important. But the field work is also important for us to start this type of change laboratories with an hypothesis of what is it that is not working in this activity. And of course, we keep the hypothesis for ourselves because we are ready to trash it, this hypothesis, if we see that the discussions and the analysis are leading to somewhere else, because at the end of the day, it is their activity, their work, and their experience that matters. Thank you.
All right, sounds very easy and liberating. Might give it a try and see how it works out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you
very much.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Είμαστε ακριβώς στην ώρα μας. Να ευχαριστήσουμε πάρα πολύ, φύγαν οι ομιλητές μας, να ευχαριστήσουμε πάρα πολύ την Γαλήνη τη Σαπουτζάκη, τη συνάδελφο, που μας βοήθησε με τη διερμηνία. Όπως βλέπετε στο πρόγραμμα υπάρχει και άλλη μία προσκεκλημένη ομιλία, για την οποία θα υπάρχει διερμηνία. Αυτή τη φορά θα μας βοηθήσει η κυρία Αλεξία Πρίγκου, την ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ γι' αυτό. Και αναλαμβάνουμε